So today we're going to take a look at From Cold War to Hot Peace by Michael McFaul. This book is about U.S.-Russia relations. The author, Michael McFaul, is an expert on U.S.-Russia relations, shocker, and he was the diplomat during the middle years of the Obama administration. During the early years of the Obama administration, he was both a strategist as well as, before Obama was elected, he was the Russia strategist for Obama. Kind of giving a little bit of background, but he had an interest in this since high school years, and he was also involved in democratic reform following the fall of the Soviet Union in the 90s. And so he has kind of a long articulated viewpoint, and he kind of gives it out in this book, which is divided into three sections. So starting with post-revolution, which is the fall of Yeltsin. It's Gorbachev into Yeltsin. We have the revolution sort of era that he talks about, and he talks about the changing and the democratization of Russia, as well as, the changing of the economic systems and how it's integrated. And then he talks about this idea of a reset, and kind of going into it, he talks about a degradation in U.S. And Russia relations during the Bush administration, specifically following Putin's invasion of Georgia, as well as George W. Bush's invasion of Iraq. Specifically, this was a contentious point that Russia did not want or did not feel that they were properly respected on the global stage in regards to how George W. Bush handled the Iraq invasion, kind of leaving Russia out of being one of the major players. And this was a point of at which Putin felt scorned. And so following this, there was the election of I'm going to mess up the name, Medvedev, who was like a sort of interim. He was the prime minister of Putin, and really just kind of the face of the operation for one term before, as part of his term, he extended term limits, and then Putin was promptly reelected. And so he talks about, this phase, and when Medvedev, however the name's pronounced, I apologize, was in power specifically, there was a lot of progress in U.S.-Russia relations. And this is something that I found quite interesting, where there was a sort of softening, or the term that they used for the strategy was a reset, where they would engage, in spots where they could engage, but not overall just seek engagement and appeasement, this type of stuff. That was what the strategy was. And they worked together on a lot of things, of which Michael McFaul was very proud of. But this is when, the economics were going well for Russia and these sorts of things. But following, internal unrest after Putin was reelected, and there was some, controversy around his reelection, some parliamentary seats there was indications of voter fraud and this sort of stuff, and his own election might not have been legitimate. Medvedev, by the way, is much more kind of reserved, or sorry, not Medvedev. McFaul is much more reserved about the degree to which Putin is interfering with elections and is toxic. Then another book that I've read and reviewed on here, which is Winter is Coming by Garry Kasparov, who actually ran against Russia, or ran against Putin at one point in the election. But following this kind of 2012 re-election of Putin for his third term, there was the price of gas was falling, there was less economic growth, and there was a lot more unrest in Russia specifically. And so as a result of this, there was a lot more internal unrest, and he being Putin, blamed this on America, and then there was a sharp negative turn down in relations between the United States and Russia, which is kind of brings us to the third section of the book. The first section is the fall of Yeltsin, and just kind of short, the revolution. The second is the reset, this productive period, largely under Medvedev. And then the third section is the reaction period, where Putin starts, kind of going after U.S. relations, and then invades Ukraine for the first time, not the second time. This book was written in 2018, I think. So it was before the second invasion of Ukraine, and I largely read it, and just to kind of add a little bit more background, McFaul was operating as first the strategist, and then the ambassador. And this is where his kind of perspective comes from. I think he was the strategist till like 2009, 2010, and then he was the ambassador for another couple years in Moscow. He spent multiple, I think, well over a dozen years living in Russia himself, and so this kind of gives texture to what he's talking about. A lot of what he's talking about is diplomatic agreements, trying to sort them out, being the go-between, being the strategist for these types of things. And a lot of times it would come down to Obama and Medvedev kind of making agreements and this sort of thing. And then largely any sort of progress stopped when Putin retook power, and the strategy abruptly changed, and then it stopped being a reset, and it became more aggressive disengagement. And I found that this kind of tenor was very much more nuanced than Gary Kasparov's book, although I don't necessarily disagree with Kasparov. Kasparov was largely focused on the corruption and problematizing Putin and human rights abuses and this sort of thing. And, this Michael McFaul's book is much more coming from the perspective of being interested in the diplomacy element and, the reality of the situation, which is you have to, diplomatically speaking, you have to deal with people you find repugnant, which he seems to find Putin, and with a long story short. And so this has been interesting. I largely read this book as a point of balance, because I knew that on some level, with Gary Kasparov being my primary source of information on things Putin, not that I'm saying in any way defending Putin, but the degree to which Gary Kasparov's perspective is not nuanced or like inserted into a larger political context, especially as it relates to the United States and other deeper concerns. He was a member of the opposition to Putin, and I think he's probably more well-informed on Putin. Perhaps, maybe not. McFaul is an academic expert on U.S.-Russia relations, so maybe this is a miss. But I thought that it would make a nice form of balance, and so this is why I read this. Often I think it's good practice to, if you think something very strongly, or if you have a strong opinion on something, to try and balance it with opposing opinions. Although this is not an opposing opinion, it is just a different sort of angle, and I was pretty happy having read it, despite the scores overall on this book, which are low. So let's get into the scores. For utility, I gave this a 3.5. I really don't see this book being tremendously useful to anyone. To the extent it would be useful, or actually, let's back up 1 second before we get into scores. I did find at the end, there was quite a bit that I found interesting in regards to, there's a chapter on basically in regards to Trump vis-a-vis Putin and this sort of stuff. And it's quite a lot to summarize, but one thing I found particularly interesting is that McFaul goes out of his way to outline how the Trump administration was pretty aggressively anti-Putin, while Trump himself was very pro-Putin, which shows a sort of disjunction in sort of sense between the decision, or I don't even know how to articulate who's the decision maker there, and McFaul doesn't really take a shot at it. He just highlights that there is a discrepancy between, how Trump seemed to behave, and also the way his administration behaved, which I think McFaul kind of implies that there are other people kind of making the decisions or cajoling Trump into having a certain position in this sort of stuff. He talks about Russia's interference in the 2016 election, not too much at length, but he does talk about it, as well as, citing a whole bunch of stuff related to it. But I found that part interesting as well, and that's kind of in an afterward type of thing, and it is also from 2018. So it's not containing any sort of information following that, as well as not any information about the second invasion of Ukraine, which I wanted more backstory information, in regards to Putin coming on up, which the book's maybe, 40%. In the time period of Putin. I think that the title was a little bit of a clickbait, or the subtitle, An Ambassador in Putin's Russia, because he talks about a lot of stuff not related to Putin. But anyways, let's get into the scores. So for utility, I gave it a 3.5. My feeling is that To the degree it's useful, it's just helping you kind of understand the United States-Russia situation a little bit better. In particular, that there's a sort of ebb and flow to how diplomatic relations have been going, but that very consistently, if you're going to make an objection to the Russian regime, it's like on anti-democratic practices, autocratic sort of tendencies and human rights violations, these sort of things. But McFaul, of course, is coming from a perspective where you have to try, you can't just be idyllic, and you have to try and engage where it's useful. And so this perspective I found very refreshing, because it's not anyone defending Putin, not even close, and it's not anyone... his objective here isn't to solely denounce Putin, and so it was a bit of an angle that I found interesting. He obviously has a negative opinion on Putin, but that's not the primary thrust of the book. The primary thrust of the book is just describing the changes of the relations, of which he seems to largely blame Putin for the negative downturn, on the basis that he thinks that Putin thinks that the United States was trying to remove him from office and has a lot more agency than the US really does. But anyway, for novelty, I gave it a 6.5. This maybe is a little bit of a high score. I think that this perspective was a bit refreshing. A lot of what's in like the cultural atmosphere and discussion is just largely a very... it's not coming from this perspective, and I'm curious to... I have not read McFaul's kind of follow-ups, what he feels now, or any of his commentary on the Ukrainian invasion. I will probably look into that a little bit later. The second Ukrainian invasion, he obviously has a strong opinion about the first that he expresses in the book, which is that it's horrifying, and of course the disengagement from the part of the West is important. But anyways, I found that was interesting. I think that having a larger texture, more textured understanding for what's going on in Russia is perhaps useful, and to that degree, the novelty is a plus. It's also a little bit of a unique perspective, but okay, I gave it a 6.5. It's probably too high. For entertainment, I gave it a 5. I found it entertaining to the extent it was interesting, but it's relatively dry. Or I don't want to say it's dry. The writing is engaging enough. It's not tremendous. It's very clear. It's not poorly written. The guy is he was an academic. He was an activist in Russia, and then he was an academic, and then he worked with the Obama campaign, and then he worked as a strategist for the Obamas, or for Obama, and then he was an ambassador, and then he came back to being an academic, and that's kind of his purview, right? And so it's well enough written. But it doesn't seem primarily written to entertain. You do hear, it's interesting hearing kind of the various things about diplomacy and how the procedures in which things work and the way that meetings occur and this sort of stuff. But this is what he talks about, and while it is interesting, it doesn't have a sort of arc that's compelling or a story. One thing that was interesting was just hearing about how, when in Russia, the way that they can meet to talk about stuff with their own staff is they basically have portable safe rooms, or these massive tents, or fully sealed chambers that they can talk inside of, where it's a submarine. It's called skiffs or subs or whatever. I forget the terminology that he uses to talk about, but it's in order to avoid being eavesdropped on and this sort of stuff when talking about anything strategic, and it's to avoid being eavesdropped on by something that Obama's going to talk to Medvedev in 2 hours on. So in order to avoid a 2-hour leak, you go into this chamber that's and have this uber secrecy, which I found interesting. For style, I give it a 5. Kind of explained that to some degree. It's strong enough. It's not crazy prose. I think that his primary skill is probably writing academic sorts of stuff and not what he wrote here, which is more of a memoir type of thing. But he writes well enough academically or, within his purview such that it reads fine enough. Readability, I gave it a 6.5. It's just very clear, which you would expect with an academic. There's no or I could not recall a single time where I like was reading and I was like, man, that's a poorly worded sentence. Like, it's just not clear what he's referring to or what he means or this sort of thing. You know, it was easy to understand him in this sort of thing. And for interest, I gave it a 6.5 because I think that it is an interesting topic, and that, you know, how should I say, the acquiring multiple perspectives on the matter, I think, is useful. And so, you know, we have Dear Old Gary, which is that why Vladimir Putin is the enemy of the free world and must be stopped. Very Armageddon-y. And I don't disagree with Gary, by the way, but I think that it is useful to have a sort of perspective of, you know, someone who's a diplomat, who likes Russia a lot and likes Russian culture. Of course, Gary does too, so I shouldn't... But I think that anytime you're trying to evaluate something, having multiple perspectives is usually useful, so I'm pretty happy to have read the book. It was quite a long book. It was a little bit of a slog, and so, yeah. As far as recommendations go, I don't think I would very widely recommend this book. I think that it is long. It's a bit of a memoir type thing, and that there's probably an easier way to access the types of information regarding the developments of U.S.-Russian relations over time. And so in order for this book to be a sort of niche, or to fulfill, for someone to, like, for me to want to recommend it to someone, they would have to be specifically both interested in Russia-U.S. relationships, maybe want a little bit of a different perspective that's, you know, that's a little bit oblique, and or interested in the project of what does diplomacy look like, what does working at an embassy look like, what does trying to negotiate between two superpowers, or Russia and a superpower, as it were, what does this look like? If this was like, if someone was interested in this type of stuff specifically, then I would recommend it, but I don't think I would broadly recommend this. I certainly would not recommend it as widely as I would Gary Kasparov's book, Winter is Coming, which is more a strict denunciation of Putin that really kind of delves into, you know, McFaul, you sometimes have to read between the lines. He talks about a guy who he was actually a good friend with, who was like Minister of the Interior. He was some sort of minister under Yeltsin, and he very could have... Yeltsin basically put Putin in power, and Yeltsin could have put this other guy in power. It's like, I think it was Boris Nemtsov, something like this. And McFaul seems to have a friendly relationship with him. And then he reports that Boris was assassinated outside the Kremlin. And he doesn't make an accusation as to who did it, I don't really think, if I recall correctly, in this book. But he's like, you read between the lines, it's pretty... I think it's evident that he thinks it's Putin, whereas, like, Gary just comes out and talks about the exact same guy. He's like, yep, he gunned him down. And if I recall correctly, this is the guy who, in Gary's book, he talks about how the Kremlin sent the wife flowers after assassinating the husband, which is a macabre type of thing. But this isn't meant to be a review of the Kasparov book, just merely a highlighting of kind of the different tenor. You know, you can tell that McFaul's not trying to burn any bridges and this sort of thing, and he's being a diplomat to some extent. Although, I think it's also very interesting to hear the diplomatic strategies that he talks about, you know, in terms of trying to engage and, you know, it's refusing to come to the table and just taking your ball and going home type of attitude towards relations between other countries is just negative. But you have to both like recognize and not be idyllic and be like everyone can change. You have to recognize that a nation is problematic while simultaneously trying to engage with them. At least this was before the second invasion of Ukraine, at which point I think engagement at this point is impossible, but it is interesting to see a little bit more of a nuanced perspective. So as far as recommendations, that's where it would go. If you like this video, feel free to like, comment, subscribe, share, hit the notification button. Yeah, I think I hit them all on the head. And other than that, have a good day.